everyone, I hope you're doing well. Today we have a new gouache painting tutorial and we'll paint this summer field landscape. The next tutorial will feature this lighthouse scenery and it will probably come out sometime next month. So this is kind of the first part of this 2 gouache painting series. You'll need some type of thicker paper. I'm using a watercolor sketchbook with cold pressed paper and we'll start by quickly sketching a few lines of this landscape. I usually like to start the sketches by marking the horizon line, which in this painting is quite a bit above the center. The sky is not gonna be an important part of this painting at all, so we want a lot of attention to be on the ground, which is why we wanted to take a lot of space here. Then we'll add a rough guide for this pathway in the center of the field, and we'll also draw some indications for this tree here on the left side. This sketch does not need to be perfect, so you will see that I'm not even gonna finish these tree branches because they'll be covered by leaves anyway. And then the last thing we'll mark to this sketch are these shadow areas in the ground. So the lights and shadows are one of the main points I want us to focus on in this quick painting practice. So we'll have this shadow from the tree that will cross over the pathway as well, and then we'll add another darker grass area at the front of the painting. But that's pretty much all for the sketch, and now let's take out the paints and start from the easy part, which will be the sky here. I'm gonna create this gradient effect in the sky with this peachy color and this slightly grayish light blue. However, if you want to keep this simple, you can just use one color such as blue or maybe some kind of shade with a hint of gray. However, if you also want to go for the gradient, we'll start by adding the peachy color to the horizon line, and then I'll add the blue color at the top, and then just kind of mix these colors together with a bunch of white as well. The white color will help to blend the colors and lighten things up a little bit, and I'm using a flat brush for all these initial layers in the painting because it makes applying color to larger areas pretty quick, and that's precisely what we want for these initial sloppy layers. So now that we have the sky out of the way, it's time to start working on the ground. What I want us to focus on here is starting from the lightest color, which is gonna be this dusty yellow shade at the horizon, which I blended from permanent yellow, yellow ochre, and white. And I think I did add a little bit of the peachy color in there as well, since I had it on the palette. As always, you don't need to own the exact colors I'm using. You can blend every single color of the rainbow by just having your primary colors, so red, blue, and yellow with some white and black. So all these extra shades are just gonna save some time from the blending, but are not necessary. Anyway, I know this yellow is not gonna look very bright here against the white background just now, but in the end it will be the most highlighted point in the painting. Then I'm slowly starting to mix a bit of green into this yellow mixture and start to work my way down on this grass area. So I'm slowly adding more and more green to make this color darker. And lastly, we're gonna cover the shadow areas with this darkest green shade. At this point, these layers definitely don't need to look perfect. There's also no right or wrong way to go about this step. So the important thing here is just to lay this background color that we can start building the details on. I'm using a fairly dry brush here because it helps to create a bit of texture to these strokes. However, if you want especially the edges of your painting to look cleaner, it might be a good idea to add just a little bit of water when you apply color around the edges. And of course, you could also choose to cover the edges with tape, which would give you very nice, clean outlines. But since I was just going for a quick painting practice here, I didn't bother with tape on the edges. Burnt umber and magenta are the last colors I'm gonna add to my palette, and we're gonna use these in the pathway. So first I mixed some of the brown with the initial peachy color again, and threw in some blue as well to make this color slightly grayer. And that's the color I'm gonna add to the pathway here in the center. Then when it comes to the shadows of this pathway, I wanted to create a more cool toned blue tone for that. And since I didn't want to add blue to my palette just for this purpose, I took some of the dark green and mixed it with magenta to create this dark, cool tone blue color, which is going to be good for the shadows. I know everything still looks very sloppy at this point, but again, it doesn't really matter because we're gonna start adding all the details in a little bit and clean this all up. I chose to start the detailing phase by painting the tree because it's gonna take up quite a bit of space here on the left side, and I thought it would be a little bit easier to imagine or visualize the shadow on the ground after we have painted the tree. So this is when I finally switched to a round brush that allows a little bit more detail in your strokes, and I'm using burnt umber for this tree trunk. You don't need that many branches here, and they also don't need to look perfect because the leaves are gonna take up most of the space and they will also kind of cover most of these branches. And then when it comes to the leaves, I'm again starting to work from the lightest colors and moving to the darker ones. With gouache, you often do things the other way around, so starting from the darkest colors and then adding lighter details on top, but I think it's sometimes easier to first mix the light color and then go darker by mixing your darker green colors little by little, rather than doing things the other way around. So that's why I decided to do it this way here. So I was trying to add some glow to the outer leaves by using this similar yellow color we used on the ground, and then mixed more yellow ochre and green and started to add these darker and darker leaves with these tapping motions. Again, I'm working with quite a dry brush, which helps to create these very broken textured strokes. A more wet brush would definitely work as well. It will just create a little bit more defined round strokes, which you also often see in gouache paintings. I also tried to leave some of these light areas almost inside of the tree as well, just to add a few bold spots to break the dark shapes a little bit. It's also a good idea to leave a little bit of the sky peeking through here and there, which again will just break the shape of the tree a little bit. We'll add the darkest shadowy leaf parts kinda towards the center and upper corner of this tree. And if you feel like you covered a little bit too much of the lighter colors with the dark ones, you can always go back and reapply some of the lighter colors. Again, we are not trying to create a world-class painting here, so all of these shapes and strokes do not need to be perfect. I've actually been painting a lot with oils recently and I've really enjoyed it. You might know that if you follow me on Instagram stories. And something I've learned from watching a lot of oil painting videos is this less is more approach, especially in your practice paintings or just having a different view on practicing in general. I think if you're looking to get the most improvement, you'll get that by painting a lot of quick paintings rather than giving yourself a lot of pressure to create one perfect painting that you're gonna waste a lot of time on. The same definitely applies to gouache or any other medium. And I think what is really important, especially in the beginning, is learning to mix colors and find the light and dark values in your painting. I've studied a lot of landscape paintings recently, and something that is often used in very eye-catching landscapes is this focal point in the painting where your lightest light and darkest dark meet somewhere on the horizon. So in this painting, it would be this area under the tree here, where our darkest shadow part is right next to the light field. And this is going to create a spot in the painting where your eye is automatically drawn. I also tried to balance this a little bit by placing some of these messy trees or bushes on the right side, and also by adding some of these darker trees behind our big tree here. So now this light stripe of field is almost sandwiched by these two dark areas, and it also has the dark tree trunk in the middle. But anyway, that was just a side note of landscape painting in general. But whenever you're happy with the amount of details in the tree, we can move on to polish the crown a little bit and add some grass strokes to blend the different shades of green. I switched to an even thinner and pointier round brush here, and I'm just starting to make these grass-like strokes all over the crown while trying to mix the tone and shade of the color a little bit too. I guess the main idea is that the lighter green tones are gonna show up in the darker parts, and the darker green tones are gonna show up in the lighter parts. So thinking about that while choosing the color of your strokes might be helpful, and you'll see how doing this will slowly start to blend those very harsh looking areas together. Adding some darker lines of strokes almost in the lighter parts will also add a bit of dimension to the crown. And then you can do the same thing by adding a few lighter yellow strokes here and there, which will again just break the grass area a little bit and add some eye-catching detail. I'm using quite quick strokes here to paint the grass, which will help to keep them quite thin. And I'm also trying to consider painting strokes in all directions instead of keeping all of them leaning the same way, if that makes sense. Also, I'm again working with a pretty dry brush here, and sometimes I feel like there's pretty much nothing left in my brush, but it will just add the tiniest bit of texture and color here and there. Then if at any point you feel like you made a very noticeable or too thick stroke somewhere, you can always clean your brush a little bit and blend that area with some clean water or the initial color of that spot. Then at some point you can also choose to maybe add some flowers here and there. I decided to go with some lilac flowers, which will add a bit of contrast with all the yellow tones in the ground. And then I'm also adding some white flowers here and there. Again, something you might want to consider is the size of the flowers. So here at the front, the flowers are gonna look a little bit bigger, a little bit more defined. And then when we move further and further away in the painting, they're gonna be smaller and much blurrier. So if you choose to draw flowers anywhere in the distance, just some blurry colored lines are all you need. So it might start to look a little bit unrealistic if you keep the flowers very defined all the way to the distance, because that's not really how our eyes catch the detail in the nature. Lastly, I decided to add a little bit more shadow to the pathway, so I mixed this even darker blue tone by again using the dark green and magenta together, and I'm adding this mainly to the shadow areas, but also kind of on the edges of this pathway all around. If you feel like your path looks a little bit weird, it might help to add some shadow and darker grass strokes along the edges of it, because otherwise it might almost look like the path is above the field and not the other way around. This detailing phase is one that you can use as much or as little time as you have. I'd say that for me, this painting took maybe an hour to an hour and a half. And you could even keep it way shorter than that by leaving out a lot of these details at the end. Also, if there's any part of this painting that feels a little bit too much for you right now, like maybe you don't want to deal with the pathway or the tree feels a little bit too difficult, you could absolutely just leave them out and practice the other parts instead. After you've done all your final touches and adjustments, we are finally done with this summer field painting. I really hope you found this video interesting and will give this painting a go. And if you do, please let me know how it went for you in the comment section below. If this was your first time around here and you'd like to stay tuned for more painting and journaling, please consider subscribing. In the next painting tutorial, we'll paint this lighthouse scenery that you saw in the beginning, which will use almost the same colors as we used in this one. But I guess that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a lovely day or night wherever you are, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye bye!